All right, hello students, it's Ms. Howard here. I sure wish I was in class with you guys instead today, but I've got a little lesson plan for you. This is the last lesson before your test, which is on Thursday. So tonight, make sure you do the 216 homework that goes along with this, and now you'll be able to do question number 4 on the review packet. So make sure you have a completed review packet for tomorrow so that you can ask any questions that you might possibly have. We're going to be talking about applying the properties of operations to multiply and divide rational numbers. So you will need your green property card. You will need this sheet here, and as you can see, I've added more properties. So make sure that you add them as well because you can use them on the test on Thursday. Right here, you'll see that we have the associative property of multiplication now, which the abbreviation is ASSOC with an X. The commutative property of multiplication, the COMM with an X, the multiplicative identity property of 1, IDX, and the existence of multiplicative inverses, multiplicative inverse. Up to this point, we had only used addition, and now we will be using multiplication. If you need to pause at this time to copy it down further, please do so. But now we are going to move on to the notes. All right, our very first problem tells us to evaluate the expression using order of operations. So you can see that just means that we're going to move from left to right since every single number is either multiplied or divided. Okay, so we're going to first take our -6. Well, we could rewrite that as -6 over 1. We know that's the same thing. -6 divided by 1 is -6 times 4/5 divided by 2/5 times -10 divided by 12 over 7. All right, so here you can see there's nothing that we can cross out or simplify, so we're just going to multiply across. -6 times 4 is a -24. 1 times 5 is 5. All right, divide by 2/5. Well, that's pretty difficult to do. So instead, we're going to multiply by the inverse, which we already know how to do. Remember, if you have dividing by a fraction, you can multiply by its inverse. The inverse of 2/5 is 5 over 2. I'm going to also do that over here and multiply by 7/12 because 7/12 is the inverse of 12/7. All right, well, I can cancel out the 5's, and they become 1's. 5 divided by 5 is 1. 5 divided by 5 is 1. I can cancel out the 2 and make it a 1 because I can divide -24 by 2, which makes it a -12. Okay, so now I have -12 across over 1. Well, -12 divided by 1 is just -12. Times -10 times 7 over 12. Well, -12 times -10 yields a positive 120 times 7 over 12. I could put 120 over 1, because 120 divided by 1 is still 120, and see if I can simplify anything. Well, 12 goes into 120 10 times. So that becomes a 10, and that just becomes a 1. And 10 times 7 is 70 over 1, which is equal to 70. The next thing we are going to do is evaluate it using properties. The whole point of using properties is to make it easier and more efficient to solve your problems. Certain numbers go easier together when you multiply them. Notice up here when we had to do -6 times 4/5. It got us -24 over 5. This is to try to eliminate those kind of odd and kooky numbers. So what we're going to first do is if I ever have division, I always right away make its multiplicative inverse. So I'm going to multiply by the inverse. So divided by 2/5, I'm going to times by 5 over 2 times a -10 times 7 over 12. All right, and that's the multiplicative inverse. Make sure you guys are writing down the steps. All right. I'm next going to use the associative property of multiplication. It's very similar to the associative property of addition in that the associative property of addition let us add numbers in the middle. Like we could put, if there was a problem that had 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, we would be able to add the 2 and 3. You would still get the same answer. You could add the 2 and 3 first. So that's the same thing over here. We can multiply in any order and we'll still get the same answer. So I'm going to multiply these numbers here. So I can get rid of the 5s. 5 divided by 5 is 1. And then 2 divided by 2 is 1. And 4 divided by 2 is 2. So I've got now negative 6 times 2 over 1, which is just 2, times negative 10 times 7/12. I'm going to solve from left to right. Well, that's just using order of operations, which is just solving. So my step here is solve. Negative 6 times 2 is a negative 12 times negative 10 times 7/12. Well, I'm going to put my 7/12 over here by my negative 12 so I can cancel out the 12s. Oops, and then I forgot to do it. All right, negative 12 times 7 over 12 times a negative 10. Rearranging the order, that's our commutative property of multiplication, which is also similar to the commutative property of addition, because the commutative property of addition said 1 plus 2 plus 3 is the same thing as 1 plus 3 plus 2. Well, that's the same thing with our multiplication. We can put it in any order. Okay, negative 12, we can make that over 1. The 12s will cancel out, and I'm left with a negative 1 on top. So negative 1 times 7 is a negative 7 over 1, which is just negative 7. Times negative 10, we ended up with a 70. And as you can see, we got a 70 as our answer in both methods. All right, we're going to do one more example here. Once again, we're going to start with the multiplicative inverse. So we're going to take 4 times negative 1/8 times negative 1/2 times 16 over 15, the multiplicative inverse. And that's because we took the dividing by negative 8 and said instead it's multiplying by negative 1 over 8. Because negative 8 is the same thing as negative 8 over 1. And then over here, we multiplied by 16 over 15 because we multiplied by the inverse of 15 over 16. All right, what we're going to do next is I'm going to use the associative property of multiplication to multiply these two numbers together. So negative 1 times negative 1, we get a positive 1 on top, and 8 times 2 is 16, times 16 over 15. Well now, once again, I'm going to do the associative property and multiply these two numbers because the 16 will cancel out very nicely. And I'm left with 4 times 1 over 15. Well, now at this point, I'm just solving, and I get an answer of 4 over 15, because you can write that as 4 over 1 times 1 over 15. Okay. All right, what you will see down here is one more thing to kind of think about. The product of two negative integers yields a positive product. Well, we learned that. Think about it. Negative 1 times negative 1 was 1. So if I have an even number of negative factors, then each negative value can be paired with another negative value, yielding a positive product. So if I have another negative 1 times negative 1, well, that makes it a positive 1. Positive 1 times positive 1 is positive. If instead I have an odd number of negative factors, then all except 1 can be paired. Think about it. If I have negative 1 times negative 1, that multiplied by each other gives me a positive 1. Negative 1 times negative 1, positive 1. Negative 1 times negative 1, positive 1. And then I'm left with still a negative 1. If I combine these, 1 times negative 1 gets me a negative answer. So what we're filling in here is an even number. An even number of negatives will give a positive answer when multiplied. An odd number of negatives will give a negative answer when multiplied. And that makes sense. Let's look back up here. How many negative signs did I have? 1, 2. So that means that's an even number. And was my answer positive? Yes. All right, let's flip it over. We're going to use what we just learned on the back side here for this. A times B times C, but all three are negative. So negative A times negative B times negative C. Well, if there's 3 negative signs, that means it's an odd number. So our answer would be a negative ABC, because that's A times B times C. Negative D times E times negative F times G. Well, I see 2 negative signs, which means our answer is going to be a positive D, E, F, G, because it's D times E times F times G. And then over here, negative 2 times negative 3 is a positive 6, and negative 1 times negative 2 is a positive 2, and 6 times 2 is 12. Well, that makes sense. There's 4 negatives, so my answer is going to be positive. All right. The last thing we're talking about is using the distributive property to multiply rational numbers. So if we have to multiply 6 times 5 1/3, we're going to decompose the mixed number and then multiply the factor outside the parentheses by each part of the mixed number. So decompose first. So I'm going to say 6 times 5 plus 1/3. All right, now I'm going to use the distributive property, which is also on your green sheet if you need to reference it. That means we can apply this 6 when we multiply it to both numbers. So 6 times 5 plus a 6 times 1/3. Okay, well, 6 times 5, that is 30. 6 over 1 is the same thing as 6. Well, we can simplify that then. Divided by 3 is 1, and divided by 3 is 2. 2 times 1 is 2, over 1 times 1. So 2 over 1 is the same thing as 2. And 30 plus 2 equals 32. All right. Right here, we've got 9 times negative 3 plus negative 1/2. Be very careful, don't forget the negative sign in front of the 1/2. All right, so to solve, we're going to do 9 times negative 3 plus 9 times negative 1/2. 9 times negative 3 is a negative 27, plus, that can be rewritten as 9 over 1. 9 times negative 1 is negative 9 over 1 times 2 is 2. That can be rewritten as negative 27 plus negative 4.5. If you need to see that real quick, 9 divided by 2, 2 goes into 9 4 times. 2 times 4 is 8, with 1 left over 2. And that negative sign is out in front, so we must keep it. Negative 27 plus negative 4.5 is negative 31.5. Okay. We have one final expression to evaluate. All right, and we're going to use the properties. So the first thing we always do is our multiplicative inverse. So what I did was I multiplied right here by 3 over 2 because the inverse of 2/3 is 3 over 2. Took the division, instead multiplied by the inverse. Same thing here. Oops, I'm so sorry, I made a mistake, guys. I did not remember to multiply by the inverse here. Multiply, because right here it's dividing by -1/2. So instead you are multiplying by -2 over 1. The inverse of -1 over 2 is -2 over 1. Okay. All right, I apologize for the mistake. Make sure you've changed it to -2 over 1. All right, let's use the commutative property of multiplication to move some of the numbers around. Let's put 1 times 3 over 2 times -2 over 1 times -8 times 3. So I just moved this number right here to right there. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the associative property of multiplication and multiply these two right here together. Well, I can simplify the 2 and the 2 and both divide by 2, so I get 1 and -1. All right, so 1 times 3 times -1 is -3. -3 over 1 is just -3. Okay, let's first do this. 1 times -3 is -3. Since I'm moving from left to right, that's just solving. -3 times -8 is a positive 24 times 3. And I end up with my final answer as 72. Okay. And once again, let's double check. I have two negative numbers. A negative times a negative yields a positive. All right, thank you so much, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you guys tomorrow. Have a good day.